You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
You're listening to the Great Plains Archaeology Podcast. Join me as we uncover the rich histories of North America's Great Plains, exploring the latest archaeological discoveries and past cultures that shape this storied region. Welcome to the podcast. Welcome to episode 19 of the Great Plains Archaeology Podcast. I am your host, Dr. Carlton Shield Chief Gover, and I'm absolutely thrilled to have you join me on this exciting journey through the rich and fascinating histories of North America's Great Plains. Today, I am joined by Dr. Alex Craib. You guys have probably heard from him before. If you listen to Life in Ruins, he was on one of the early episodes. We're super happy to have him on today. And so real quick, things have changed since we first had Alex on a podcast years ago. He is now an adjunct professor at Bluegrass Community and Technical College, and he has finished up his PhD from the University of Wyoming Department of Anthropology. And he specializes in Paleo-Indian archaeology and hunter-gatherer lifeways. Alex, it is such a pleasure to have you on. How you doing, man?
Pretty good, man. It's good to see you again. Happy to be back on.
Dude, super happy. We just started the show. Just started having guests on. So for a while, it was just me lecturing. And then we had some feedback by the producers that were like, you do much better when you have a guest. You should probably start bringing that back. So we kicked it off last episode with having David on to talk about canids in Great Plains archaeology. And it went super well. And I immediately started hitting up all the old Wyoming folks. And we're going to have a pretty dominant Northwest Plains region show for a little bit, hitting all the old classics from different sites across. So you, Dr. Maddie Mackey, and then a couple Indigenous folks from the Northwest Plains as well. So super happy you could be on.
For a good long time.
Yeah, I got fieldwork coming up, so I have to get a couple episodes ready to go. So cranking out a couple here in May. Real quick, Alex, the topic of your dissertation, we touched on it briefly years ago when you were in the midst of it, was looking at Alm Rockshelter in the Bighorn Mountains, I believe, in north central-ish Wyoming.
Yeah, so it's like right in the transition between the Bighorn Basin and the Bighorn Mountains over on the eastern side of the basin. And it's a stratified rock shelter that's got about 12,000 years of pretty much continual occupation and uses a logistical hunting camp.
So I worked there twice, both times with you early on in my career. Yep. You were a young burgeoning PhD student with hope in their eyes, and I was a drooling master's student who didn't know anything about archaeology. Why was Alm Rockshelter selected to be the topic of your PhD dissertation?
So I've always had an interest in hunter-gatherers, and this is a site that allows you to look at hunter-gatherer behavior over a long period of time. Because it's continuously occupied, you can look at the longue durée, as it were, and look at various outside factors like climate, population data, and see how changes in rock shelter usage over time is correlated or not with these various outside factors. Try to get an idea of how mobility, and particularly hunter-gatherer mobility in this case, is influenced by things like climate and population change.
Excellent. So what's the difference between a rock shelter and a cave? Because I imagine a lot of the listeners are familiar with cave formations themselves, but what makes a rock shelter just different from a cave or just a cliff face?
I'm sure there's a geologic definition, and someone out there will be upset with my answer and my operating definition, but my rule of thumb was always a rock shelter doesn't have a dark zone, and a cave does have a dark zone. There is a part of a cave where there is no natural light at all, and it is completely black, versus a rock shelter, which is always lit up from the outside, and most of the time they're overhangs or cliff faces that don't get wet when it rains.
Yeah, there's like a kind of a somewhat of a natural umbrella, right? That you can sit.
Yeah, there's an overhang usually.
Yeah, so people don't get wet. Excellent. And the site itself, I'm like digging deep back into the old days, almost eight years ago at this point.
Way back to 2018.
Yeah, way back to the summer of 2018. No, 2017, 2018. Yeah, 2017, 2018. Yeah. The site itself is on private property in Correct. Wyoming. And the nearest town is it 10 Sleep?
Yeah. Yeah, the nearest big town is 10 Sleeper, Worland. Hyattville's like a little crossroads with a mercantile and a saloon. But yeah, to get proper supplies.
And it's like a 2-hour drive to get up there, correct?
40 minutes to get to either Worland or 10 Sleep, but from Laramie, it was like an 8-hour journey across the state of Wyoming.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah, no, it was a haul to get up there. And even it's dirt roads. I remember folks giving me a hard time about taking my wee little Ford Fiesta down that thing.
We made you park it at the parking lot, and then we drove you up to camp in a pickup truck.
Precisely. It's not an easy place to get to. And even for past human populations, like it is basically down a canyon, right?
So since it's close to the opening of the canyon, like where the canyon meets the basin, it sits adjacent to a floodplain that's relatively wide. This river is really fast moving. You can cross it in certain parts, but when it gets deep, the current's really fast. Wouldn't have been all that difficult to get to. It would have been a nice stopping point on the road up to the mountains for summer hunting and then down into the basin for winter living. It's conveniently located just around the bend, as it were, from the mouth of the canyon.
Excellent. So you mentioned early on with this site, with Alm Rockshelter, so you're talking like what, 15,000 years of
about 12. Our oldest occupied strata are somewhere in the 11, like 11.1, 11.2 Cal BP. Let me check my radiocarbon dates.
Yeah, 11,000.
Yeah, somewhere in there.
So like 11,000 years ago, if we convert that to like BC AD, we're looking at what, 9,000 BC?
Give or take.
Yes, give or take a year of Sundays or so, just in the ballpark. So how many occupations are present? Is this a multi-component site or is this a single occupation?
This is a multi-component site. It honestly is really hard to differentiate kind of periods of occupation. So what I did for my dissertation was I looked at the debitage densities over depth and basically looked at increased debitage frequencies as periods of increased site use. And that seems to be the best way to tease out those phases. In terms of occupations, because it was a hunting camp, it would have been used sparingly during really specific periods of time during the year. So we probably have a lot of cases of palimpsests where you have multiple occupation events occurring on the same kind of stratigraphic level. So what we're seeing when we're excavating it is actually culmination of thousands of occupations, sometimes all together on one surface and sometimes separated by deposition.
And that's one of the things I find most fascinating about the site. Like when we talk about Paleo-Indian or archaic archaeology in the Americas, we're talking about hunters and gatherers, where they're so ephemeral, hard to find on the landscape, where the vast majority of the evidence that we're able to see, because it lasts the test of time, are kill sites, and that's due to like just bias. It's easier to find eroding bison bones that then lead to the discovery of a projectile point to show it's archaeology, not paleontology. But to have a site that dates to that old, 11,000 years ago, to have multiple occupations of where people are actually living and doing the day-to-day, where hunting activity is not as maybe a frequent as an occurrence in their lifespans. What were you able to interpret from that site, or what perspectives did the data illuminate into these past lifeways in the Bighorn Basin?
I primarily looked at the lithics, so I can talk a lot about it from that regard. We did also recover some organic and perishable materials as well, which I think are arguably the most interesting things. In terms of what the lithic assemblage tells us is that it was used relatively lightly by Paleo-Indians. There are 3 distinct techno-complexes that we see at the site, which is very cool. This kind of foothill plains complex is something that Doc Frizen had talked about, written about, but never really had the opportunity to expand on. And this is a site that is well dated and does have some examples of that foothill plains. And then in terms of the early archaic, it's one of the largest assemblages that we have at the site. the Middle Archaic being the biggest. But it shows just a lot of diversity in how the points were styled. The overall shapes are relatively similar, but the ways that they were actually hafted onto foreshafts for darts is pretty variable, which I think is really interesting because it says a lot about how people were thinking about their technology. You could read further into it and talk about group dynamics and group identity in terms of technology. In terms of lifeways, I think finding bone needles shows that other activities than just the maintenance of hunting weapons occurred at logistical camps, at hunting camps. Maintaining your clothing is just as important as maintaining other aspects of your hunting kit. So I think finding some worked bone, we found some actual shell bead ornaments. It just shows that there's a kind of a diversity of artifacts and an importance within the rounds to these sites.
Absolutely. And that's a great place to take our first quick break. We'll be right back with Dr. Alex Craib to continue talking about Alm Rockshelter. Stay tuned. And we're back with episode 19 of the Great Plains Archaeology Podcast. We're still here with Dr. Alexander Craib. So, Alex, in that last segment, you mentioned a couple of organic materials that were recovered from the site. And a couple things to hit on here. You talked about a shell bead. And last I checked, Wyoming doesn't have much in the way of shells. And then bone needles. Those are incredibly rare finds, even in like relatively Mississippian or Plains village period contexts. And they were recovered from a Paleo-Indian / archaic hunting camp, like multi-component site. So could first just elaborate, what is going on with this shell that you found?
So we have 5 pieces of shell that we recovered throughout the excavation, which in the grand scheme of things doesn't sound like a lot. Some of them, it looks, are probably freshwater mollusks, so probably somewhere from rivers not all that far away, but there is a olivella shell bead, like a prepared, drilled, ground olivella shell bead, and olivella shells come from California. So somehow a Pacific species of shell made its way all the way to this itty-bitty little rock shelter up in the Bighorn Mountains of Wyoming, which is wild to think about, but it also emphasizes people still brought these important things with them on their hunting trips. It's not like they all went Spartan and stripped off all their belongings and went running out into the wilderness with just their hunting weapons.
That's incredible. And I tell that story a lot, to be honest, when I get asked what is the coolest thing you found in archaeology. And I always refer to that olivella shell being found because I didn't find it. I got to be there. That was the summer of summers of getting to work with you, Maddie Mackey, all of Bob Kelly's previous students. I think I said this before in Life in Ruins. I was the only one who didn't have a master's degree at that site. I was the most inexperienced. Had so many incredible...
There were some heavy hitters.
It was nuts. And then we found that shell and then 2 bone needles in one day, to the point where Bob Kelly, our advisor, had said, I've only found 1 in my entire career before. And today we found 2. And it was just like, holy crap. That is an incredibly rich story to tell, both in terms of the lived experience of the archaeologists uncovering the site, but also to this hunting camp that has been occupied and reused over thousands of years.
Yeah, so the needles all date to somewhere in the mid-Archaic, and if I remember correctly, the refit one that we all found, that Eric Robinson found, he was excavating around what looked like a bark mat. So like a prepared organic living surface. Bob has argued that it could possibly be sloughed off bark from a tree that was leaned up as a support post for a structure of some kind. Either is a completely valid hypothesis. However, we did find this bone needle in association with it. But yeah, again, people are bringing a lot of different things in their kits up to these hunting camps. And you need to be able to maintain your clothing. What happens if you you slip and fall down and slide down the cliff face and you rip up your pants.
Right.
You gotta fix your clothes, and you have to be self-sufficient. And the presence of these artifacts, like you said, which are rare at residential sites where we would expect to see numbers of them, their presence at a site where you don't really expect them is surprising. But it confirms a lot of what we already thought.
I also remember that wood, Matt. And I remember when whoever came down on it first, we were all very incredibly excited. Got samples of it.
I don't remember who came down on it. I don't remember. It was because we were digging in a line. It was myself, then Eric, then you, and then Bridget was next to me, and Nathaniel was off to the south, or to the east, I believe.
So me, you, and Nathaniel as the tallest, we were in the test pits. So we had to take the ladders in and out. So we were in a triangle formation, and then like Bridget, Maddie, and others were the ones in the surface above us, and they were the ones like crouched down and bent over digging.
We got to stand the whole time on sandbags. It was great.
Although being locked down there all day, because having to have one ladder to take us in and out, what did get a little claustrophobic being in there for 5 hours in the morning and 4 hours in the after lunch.
Yep.
Just like water. But I think it was Nathaniel that came down on it first. But by the time all of us had come down on it, it was just so dirty. Like I just remember that whole excavation being like, it got everywhere. It was hard to clean up. And at some point we were just like, gosh darn this wood mat. But it was pretty dense. I'd be interested trying to figure out what that was. Would it be a bark mat, or Bob was saying if they made a lean-to with a bunch of poles next to each other and that sloughing off?
But pine bark doesn't really slough off the way that we found the bark mat, or this organic layer that we came on. And that's always been my argument, is that when I've run across deadfall in the woods, it does go through a process where the bark does fall off, but it doesn't come off in such a big, complete sheet. It almost looks like it was cut. If that were the case, it almost feels like it would have had to have been cut on the backside and stripped out.
And it was deep. It was thick too, even being compressed under over a meter of dirt.
And
meter and a half, really. Rockfall and dirt. Like it was a chunky layer.
We have samples of it, and I think we've put it in to get it to try to get the bark identified. It's definitely a pine species of some kind.
That's pretty neat. After I moved on to Boulder and you guys continued to excavate there. So if I recall how that excavation process worked, is over the course of 2 summers, there was 2 sessions. There was a pre-session of just kind of Bob students, and to open the site before the field school got there. There was a 10-day session of the Wyoming field school there. And then you guys went off to another site. So like, even though that site had been excavated over the course of a couple summers, it was really only in like realistically 8-day chunks every year for a decade.
Yeah, so excavation started in 2005. There was a single test unit dug, and then they went back in 2009 where 2 other test units were dug all the way down to what used to be river sediment, so comfortably culturally sterile sediments. And then in 2014, the main block it was basically a 2x3 meter block, was established and started being excavated, and they ran field schools there, but it was only 10-day sessions, 1 10-day session per year, until 2017 when you and I joined the project. And that's when excavations really ramped up, and we did like you said, the 10-day session to open it, 10 days of field school. And then the next summer, I believe we did 4 10-day sessions out there in 2018 and took it down almost to river cobbles. There was a really big piece of roof fall that really slowed us down. I think Bob spent probably 3 whole days breaking off bite-sized chunks of it so he could take it out one piece at a time. But yeah, it was over a long period of time, but those last 2 years really were a flurry of activity.
I remember like hearing about that rock fall, and I'm sitting there looking at my phone at pictures while I'm out on eroding Pleistocene landscape in eastern Nebraska and just excavating in sand, just like butter on every trowel's edge, being like, wow, I don't miss that.
No reason to sharpen your trowel when you're digging in rock shelters.
Yeah, 100%. Bob made that joke to, who did he say it to? Like recently. I was at when I gave a presentation at Wyoming. He loves to tell people like Carlton's the only
guy that can go into a dry rock shelter and come out muddy.
Yeah, precisely. I have clammy hands, and I'm like, dude, I can't help it. Like, he's just like, how do you have so much mud everywhere? It's just, dude, because I sweat a lot.
You're lucky you were never there for backfill day. You would have been caved.
I was there for backfill day. Never. You're absolutely right.
No.
Only uncovering the site.
Maddie, myself, Chase, I want to say Abby, and maybe Molly Heron were the last ones to close it up with Bob. And he did the Thriller dance for us.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
He got it excavated before he died. And I guess that's what sparked it all, right? He told that to Maddie once. Just like,
he wanted to finish the site before he died. And somehow he trusted me to write the dissertation on it.
I got to sit next to him at the executive committee at SAAs, and they read off the names of those that have passed away. And Bob's, I know too many of those names. And I looked at him like, you better keep your name off of it for a while. We still need you, Bob. But
no, we need the Obi-Wan Kenobi of archaeology to
100%
longer.
100%. Other than like the bone needles in the shell, were there any other unexpected discoveries or reinterpretations of site use as illuminated through your dissertation on the site?
Not particularly. We also found a few pieces of cordage. In terms of perishable goods, it wasn't a particularly large assemblage compared to other sites in the area. What the lithic assemblage told me, and that was really the focus of my dissertation, was combining the lithics with the radiocarbon record of the site and using Bayesian analysis to interpret it. The lithics kind of showed me that there's not really a strong association with population or climate, but there does seem to be a relationship between them. When it gets hot and dry down in the basin, you get increased activity at the site. When it gets colder and wetter, you get decreased activity at the site. And unfortunately, none of the multitude of statistical tests that I ran could conclusively say that, but there does seem to be a trend.
Well, that'd make it like if it's dry.
Does it? No. Yeah, exactly. If it's dry and hot, people go up to the mountains where it's cool and wet. And when it's really cold and really wet in the mountains, you go down to where it's warmer and drier. And you find that happy spot right in the middle.
Precisely. Because the stream there was fed by snowmelt.
It's a perennial stream, so it's always running. And we have anecdotal evidence, we have anecdotes from ranchers talking about big droughts when the snowpack was gone and it was still running. So there's some good reason to believe that this would have been a reliable source of water. So there at least would have always been some sort of game, some sort of plant life. Like these locations tend to draw human beings to them.
100%. With that, Dr. Craib, do you have any advice for students or archaeologists interested in excavating rock shelters?
Be prepared to be very dusty.
Unless you're me, then you have to be prepared to be.
Unless you're Carlton, and then get yourself some baby wipes.
100%. Excellent. So we're going to link Dr. Craib's ResearchGate or academia.edu in the show description, where you can find a copy of his dissertation on rock shelter for those that are interested. How many pages did you end up with for that dissertation, Alex?
Somewhere in the 200, I think.
Okay. That's not bad. It's not bad at all.
It's reasonable.
Yeah. That's a reasonable dissertation.
It's a light read. Very easy. Lots of pictures.
Good. Happy to hear that. Excellent. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Next episode, we'll be recording. We'll have another interview. So we'll just kind of keep on with this trend and see how you guys like it. So until next time, enjoy the rest of your week. Thank you for listening to the Great Plains Archaeology Podcast. You can follow me on Instagram at Pawnee_archaeologist, and you can also email me at greatplainsarchpodcast@gmail.com. And remember, anybody can love the mountains, but it takes a soul to love the prairie. American author Willa Cather. The
The Archaeology Podcast Network is 10 years old this year. Our executive producer is Ashley Airy, our social media coordinator is Matilda Siebrecht, and our chief editor is Rachel Roden. The Archaeology Podcast Network was co-founded by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle in 2014 and is part of Cultural Media and DigTech LLC.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.